Greetings and welcome to Phantom's Edge. This will be Chapter 17 of this reading. Finding the Patronage 5 demolished, a rescue crew was set out to find and help any who might still be alive from the wreckage of the Bureau vessel. The fight was seen from a watchtower, sending the rescue team just as they noticed the Patronage 5 going down. The tower also kept as much visual on the Ecuador, finding it drifting off to Amadak. Fleet Admiral Pre broke into the room where they were treating Josephina and Marilyn, both severely damaged when found in the floating wreckage of the sunken battleship. Pre stood furious in their presence, not for their failure, but for how pirates could do such a thing to his fleet. Admiral Chief Cornelius burst into the room a minute later and went to his daughter's bedside, where he knelt down and asked, "Josephina, my darling, what happened?" Barely able to keep her eyes open, the Hume stared up at the ceiling, traumatized, and said, "The demon crow's nest one shot." The Admiral Chief slammed his right fist into the floor. Then Pre walked over to place his left hand on the male Hume's right shoulder and said, "Calm down, Cornelius. She will be okay." He then turned to the Perseone captain and asked, "How say you, miss?" Marilyn looked over at her superior and replied, "I got a broken left arm, but I'll manage." The fleet admiral walked over and examined the captain's wounds, then waved the doctors away. Perseone glanced around, confused, then looked up at the Lepore as he pulled out his pistol and said, "No, you won't." Marilyn tried to move away, forcing herself up against a wall, panicking as she said, "Admiral, please, you can't do this." Pre shot the captain in the stomach, watching her fall over on her bed, then put his gun away as he headed out the room and said, "I just did. You're fired." The doctors and nurses dragged out the dead woman, while Cornelius stayed at his daughter's side to wait for her recovery. The reason for Marilyn's dismissal was because of her incompetence and for her immense failure as a captain. Pre was fed up with the failure. He didn't wish to lose to the pirates anymore, but also didn't want to think that his army was becoming weaker as time flew by. Pre hated his Lepore heritage, thus left Mongoma. However, he had a realization that he could not only overthrow the empire, he could take over the world and bring peace at last. Emperor Phytogras didn't want to conquer any land other than the one he had already obtained, letting other countries roam freely and kill themselves over and over again. Pre didn't want that. The fleet admiral wanted all wars to end, either by one big truce or by annihilation of each country. However, if he could keep them in check, that too would spell peace. Yet that wasn't going to work now, what with pirates not willing to cooperate with anyone but themselves. Unfortunately, they now stand alongside the Empire and totalitarians, which meant the bureaucracy of Philae was going to be targeted for a full-scale assault. Fleet Admiral Pre entered his grand chambers within headquarters, moving to stand at the window at his bedroom that faced out over the city and towards the ocean. He stood with his arms behind his back, his left hand holding his right wrist, aiming his eyes to see the ships that came or left the docks. As the sun started to set, a knock came at the front door. Pre went to answer it, finding it to be Admiral Chief Cornelius and Vice Admiral Edison. He let the Hume and Kenai wander into his quarters, where the three admirals turned to the window in the living room facing out to the sea. At his superior's left side, Edison said, "Sorry to disturb you, sir. I just wanted to know what you plan to do." Pre watched a cargo vessel leave the docks, then said, "Cornelius?" The Hume to the right looked over at his superior and asked, "Yes, sir?" "You of all people should know I hate failure." "Yes, sir." "I let your daughter live because she's your daughter. However," Pre turned his head to glance at the Kenai and continued, "Your son, Edison, is another matter." "Sir," Edison said as he looked at his superior, "I assure you, that mongrel is no son of mine. For his betrayal, that much shall fall before the bureaucracy's might, specifically by my blade." Pre turned to gaze upon his city and said, Then, the unfortunate time for war has come. The Lepore motioned out of his room, followed by his lower admirals. He moved to the meeting hall, where he went for a podium in the back. He turned to face his other admirals and said, "Gather all troops. I'm scheduling for an emergency meeting." The two admirals before their leader quickly hit their feet together as they stood at attention, while Pre continued, "Send the message that this is an urgent call from Fleet Admiral Pre himself. All officers must report back to headquarters as soon as possible, where I shall inform them on further details to the situation." "Yes, sir," Edison and Cornelius simultaneously acknowledged. As the two headed out, shutting the double doors behind them, Fleet Admiral Pre moved to sit in a chair directly behind the podium. He went to lean back as he placed his right leg over his left, putting his hands together on his right knee. He knew it would not be long before all his soldiers were brought forth to his attention, so he just went to assemble a plan to deal with the hostile parties against Phile. It wouldn't be long before he could end this annoyance to finally gain peace. Admiral Chief Cornelius went back to his daughter's room, finding her still in her traumatized state. He knelt down and moved to gently pet her head with his left hand, then stood up and motioned out of headquarters. While being followed by the Vice Admiral at his left side, Cornelius said, "I swear, even if my own life is taken, I will murder that demon." Edison glanced over at his superior, then continued to walk alongside him as they moved to intercept any of the ship's captains from leaving the docks. The two explained to each captain and to any subordinates around about the situation, where they complied and immediately went to report back to headquarters. Afterwards, they informed a few warrant officers to stay put until all vessels were accounted for, their objective being to tell each captain to take their crew straight to headquarters for an important meeting. Unfortunately, one was not going to be making it back with their Kanai captain controlling the vessel. The Ecuador, pushed off its course to Amarak, went to sail for Houndania. However, for a moment, the ship was just drifting at sea and being steered only by the wind. No one was at the wheel. There, in the pirate ship's deck, was a cannonball hole, with a small bloodstain around it. The cannonball itself was gone, along with a certain someone that was killed in the process of the metal's flight. That someone was Martha. Thomas stood at the port side of the ship near the hole, staring out at the ocean with a painfully horrified expression. He had witnessed his own mother die in front of him, wanting to save her before this accident could happen. Kaio stood at the boy's side for comfort, while the other crew members were quiet as they waited for a reaction from either of the demon or the devil. Kaio placed his right hand onto the boy's right shoulder, staring out at the cruel blue sea as he said, "Boy, I am sorry for what has happened. It could not have been avoided. Fate is an unforgiving mistress of the world, just as the sea itself is to all of us upon it." He then looked over at the Rodania and continued, "Come now, let us take one last moment to remember her, honor her well-being, and the good times we spent together." After a minute of watching the child, him having no response to the Kanai's words, Kaio glanced over at a crew member and said, "Take the boy to my quarters to rest." "Yes, Captain," the man responded. As Apercione escorted the Rodania, Kaio turned to the rest of his crew and said, "Men, please pay your respects to our fallen comrade. She was a great woman and a fine pirate among us. Better than most. We should thank her for the gifts she has bared us, and pray her passing to the afterlife is a good one of peace that we all strive to understand." "Aye, Captain," they all called out. Kaio then looked over at another member and said, "Take hold of the wheel and set course to Houndania. After that, we will meet up with Emperor Phytogras and Fuhrer Iheklan in Amarak." "Yes, Captain," the man complied. As Kaio motioned for the bow of the ship, he was accompanied by Brunhilde and Gregory. Perry also followed behind them, while removing the sword he took from his belt. As the Kanai stepped up to barely stand on the nose of his ship, Brunhilde asked, "Are you sure it's wise to speak with those of the totalitarian party, Kaio?" Keeping his focus out at sea, Kaio replied, "Never been more wiser than wisecracking jokes, dearie." Irritated by the response, the Felina said, "Figures." Strangely, Kaio stepped to his right and purposely fell from the ship. However, he grasped the wooden panel he was standing on with his left hand, swinging himself to grasp with his right and quickly pull himself back onto the deck of the Ecuador. There, he landed a foot away from the Avifaun as they stood face to face. Perry went to hold up the Lepore craftsmanship blade he stole from the Bureau in both hands, while he said, "Captain, I wish to give you this. It's a weapon my previous superior had designed for one of his subordinates, made from the material of what the Lepore military owns." Kyle swung his right hand out and across himself to take the weapon from the soldier, then started examining it with the blade sheathed as he asked, "And how did the bureaucracy get hold of such material, let alone get approval to make this sword?" Well, it wasn't approved. Captain Akimir was sneaking around trying to find evidence about the Lepore Empire, then went to find a blacksmith out of the bureaucracy's payroll and had him fix the weapon. Kyle unsheathed the blade to examine it as well, finding it to be just the same as Vitagrass's, while Perry continued, "The Bureau already had some of the main material needed to make the weapon, which was confiscated by someone who illegally mined the material from Mongoma. However, there wasn't enough to make more than a single sword." Brunhilde turned her head to the Avifaun and said, "So that's why his sword shattered when I struck it. It was a fake." Pal began testing the weapon in hand by swinging it down, also side to side a few times, while Perry looked over at the feline and responded, "Exactly. I had the blacksmith make that for the captain, knowing the materials I gave were that of a copycat-looking steel that could break like glass when hit hard enough. However, I had the real one be made for his commander. I was going to take the sword in the meeting we were at that Thomas walked in on, but got lucky and instead was able to grab it when the commander dropped the blade." A sword was heard being sheathed as Kaio turned away to face the ocean, while Gregory turned to the Avifaun and said, "Man, Akimir sneaking around, your betrayal and Josephina's rampage? Something's just not right with those guys." "I know. I even had my doubts about staying when going through the training process to be a soldier for them. I couldn't put my tongue on it, but something about Fleet Admiral Pree was just off." "Off?" Brunhilde asked, having a confused look on her face. "How so?" "The guy always wanted total control over his team and never once spoke of peace and freedom through mission goals to his subordinates. We all just assumed that was what he wanted." "So bringing up peace was a rumor this whole time. Bastard Bureau." Just then, Kaio tossed up the sword in his hands over his head and said, "I don't want it." The Avifaun quickly caught the weapon and turned to the man, surprised, while the Kanai continued, "Throw it overboard. Only Thomas can hold that kind of a blade, and I want no one else to know of that weapon's existence." The Avifaun glanced at the sword in his hands, then looked back up at the captain and said, "But, Captain, do it!" Kaio barked. He then pointed out his left side, indicating he wanted the weapon removed from his presence in that specific direction. Perry stood holding the sword tight, uncertain if he should really toss the perfectly crafted blade away and have it sink to the bottom of the sea. However, Brunhilde walked over and took the weapon from the Avifaun as she carelessly headed to the side of the ship. The others followed, while Perry said, "Miss, please, wait." "I'm done waiting," the black cat responded. "We need to take action against Pree, and this is how we'll do it." Felina was about to throw the sword out, having raised it above her head and back slightly, when Perry grasped the weapon and said, "Please, stop. If we keep the sword, we can surely best the Bureau's army without fail. The boy could hold a backup weapon if he's the only one trusted with it." Brunhilde looked over at the Avifaun and yelled, "It's an abomination and a disgrace to not only us, but to Emperor Vitagrass. The double-bladed devil is the only one who can wield this kind of craftsmanship, and with only the two blades he already has. He alone shall use those swords against the bureaucracy to finally conquer them and bring their insane war to an end, and we shall be his support." The woman kicked the man in his stomach to get him away. Then as she threw the sword, she shouted, "Nothing more!" Watching the weapon until it splashed in the water, Kyle wondered if his plan would work at all, or even if he'd be alive long enough to see its effects unfold. However, without a clear answer to his or anyone else's mind, the Kenai was just going to forget he ever thought about it as the weapon sank and became forever lost in the depths of the ocean. Once docked at Houndanio, with the Rodenio boy unwilling to step out of the captain's chambers, Kyle walked off to find the graves of his mother and father, with Perry following as an unnecessary bodyguard. However, Brunhilde insisted he have the Avifon be at the Kenai's side, if not for his sake, then for hers. She didn't want to go personally, because of her selfish reason of wanting to play with her boy toy. The dual-edged demon was born and raised on this island, taken onto the Ecuador when he was only 12 of age. It was at 14 when Brunhilde began training the pirate. Then 10 years passed, and he left, having of course given the Black Cat a terrible gift as a means to say goodbye. Kyle's parents died of the plague, yet the boy himself was left unharmed. No one understood how the plague came and infected the Kenais, nor figured how their child survived in a perfectly healthy state. Yet, they just came to realize it was a gift from God that he was alive, giving him no trouble whenever he came to pay his respects to his deceased parents. In the center of the isle was a graveyard, with a small amount of wooden tombstones and crosses marking where someone was buried. Near the front was just one cross, yet had indications of where two separate graves were placed. Kyle knelt at them as he removed both his weapons and placed them on the ground, then bowed his head slightly to the cross as he spoke softly. "Mother, Father, I know it's been a while. I'm sorry that I wasn't here earlier this year. Got in trouble again, as you already may know. Not the usual trouble, more along crossing the Black Cat again. My bad luck with her finally got the better of me." Pyro was silent for a moment, then continued, "Jackie's still fighting for the wrong side, but I know I can get her back." Kyle chuckled, thinking about the stunt he pulled with the woman, then said, "I'm sorry. However, I believe she will soon see the error of her ways, with the sign I've given, and possibly stand at my side once more." "I already have, Kyle," Jacqueline said. Both pirates were spooked, while Kyle stood up and glanced around as Perry took out his pistol and aimed it where the voice came from. The two turned to their left towards the entrance, where the bureau captain walked out from behind a tree with her commander and lieutenant. Jacqueline raised her right hand to show she had nothing in it, then slowly went to grab her pistol. James and Rita went to grab their weapons as well. Then the three tossed the weapons onto the ground towards the pirates. Jacqueline raised her hands to surrender, while she said, "I just want to talk, Kyle." Kyle glanced over to see Perry still aiming his gun at the woman, which he then slapped it away and had it drop off to the side into the thick grass. Afterwards, he looked back at his love and said, "Jackie, there's no need for you to raise your hands with me." When he saw her lower them, Kyle continued, "No harm will fall upon you while we're here. Please." The pirate reached his right hand out for the soldier and continued, "Take a walk with me." Back on the Ecuador, a crew member tried to convince Thomas to step out of the captain's quarters. He tried bribing with food, lying that Kyle wanted him out, even told him a girl wanted his company. However, none of what the pirate said would get the boy over his loss. After his tries, the man motioned to continue his work along the ship, while Brunhilde and Gregory leaned against the starboard railing as they watched the door to the captain's chambers. "Man," Brunhilde said, "talk about being bummed." "Seriously," Gregory responded. "Kid's been in there for over 5 hours. Wonder if he'll ever come out." The Felina sighed, then went to pull her Kenai along by the leash as she went to leave the ship, and said, "Oh well, come along, Greg." With little to no resistance, the man followed and asked, "Where are we going?" "Well, since my room's no longer available, I'm going to have to find another to rent for a moment. Shouldn't we wait for the captain? As the woman lowered herself and the Kenai to the waters in an oarboat, Brunhilde replied, He'll be back in an hour or so, depending on how much he wishes to speak to his parents. That's nice. They must really be proud of him. Halfway down the ship, the black cat stopped herself and turned to slap the Kenai across his snout. However, she didn't explain why, and just continued the boat's descent to the water. Gregory, of course, rowed the boat to have it rest next to Kaio's. Yet before stepping out, the two noticed their captain, along with a few others following. They were treading the beach, heading for the shore-docked vessels. Kaio had his equipment strapped on once more, while Jacqueline and her subordinates had removed themselves of the yellow jackets the Bureau had given them. They hung the jackets on their left arms, then when they neared the boats, they tossed the coats away and onto the ground in one pile. Brunhilde looked between the three new recruits, then turned to Kaio and asked, More spies, I assume? You could say that, loves, the captain replied, pointing his right finger at the felina for a second. But then again, you really can't. Kaio reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of dynamite with a long fuse, along with a light anywhere match. The Kenai lit the stick and calmly tossed it aside into the pile of coats, then stood smiling at the black cat. Everyone but the captain looked at the man, confused, knowing the jackets were only a few feet away, and that if the stick exploded at that close of range it would hurt him, possibly everyone else around him. Jacqueline, James, Rita, and Perry all stood back by taking a few long strides. Then when the fuse was at its end, Kaio turned and did a running leap to his right, away from the dynamite as he went into the water. Brunhilde and Gregory ducked just as the explosives went off. Then they sat up to first glance at the shredded mess of the cloth that started to burn away. Everyone turned back to the dual-edged demon, who was just standing up as he went to shake off the excess water. Then Brunhilde asked, Was that really necessary? Absolutely, Kaio replied. He then turned to the feline and continued, Not. It was totally uncalled for and was quite easily avoidable. But no matter. Now then. Kaio clapped his hands together once, then pointed to Jacqueline and said, These new recruits are to be escorted back onto the Ecuador, where I will discuss their positions and duties. He then lowered his hand as he entered the other oarboat to sit down, his back to his own ship, and continued, We're shoving off to Amarak now, and I won't have any more delays in doing so. Emperor Phytogras is waiting, and I wish not to have him do so for my sake. As the others entered Kaio's boat, Brunhilde turned away as she quietly said, I hate you, demon. The two boats were collected back onto the Ecuador, where Kaio went to fit Jacqueline with 2 more rapier swords for her fighting style. He then went to check on Thomas, finding him still upset, but let him stay in the room for a little longer. The pirate ordered his crew to sail for Amarak, where they were to only resupply in artillery for the upcoming battle in Kaio's plan. He was going to end the bureaucracy that corrupted Filey with its fake means of peace, either by settling the government or by destroying it. This concludes the reading of Chapter 17. Thank you all for watching and listening. If you like what you've seen and heard, be sure to check out my other 2 novels, Lore of the Endowment and Ryu the Demon Slayer. Link will be in the description below. Other than that, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you again next week, reading Chapter 18.